Every school book tells you the same story. A potato blight hit Ireland in 1845. Crops failed, people starved. Tragic, unavoidable, natural, end of lesson. But what if I told you that Ireland was exporting enough food to feed its entire population while 1 million people died of hunger? What if the famine wasn't a natural disaster at all, but the predictable result of a system designed to extract wealth from one country and deliver it to another? Welcome to the real story of the Great Irish Famine. To understand why Ireland starved, you need to understand who owned Ireland. By the 1840s, the country had been under British control for over 600 years. The land, virtually all of it, belonged to English and Anglo-Irish Protestant landlords. Most of these landlords didn't even live in Ireland. They were absentee owners, comfortably settled in London townhouses, collecting rent from tenants they had never met and would never meet. The numbers were staggering. In some counties, over 90% of the land was owned by people who lived in England. The Irish peasantry, overwhelmingly Catholic, had no political power, no land rights, and no legal recourse. For centuries, the penal laws had stripped Catholics of the right to own land, hold public office, vote, or receive an education. Although many of these laws had been relaxed by the 1840s, their damage was already done. Generations of systematic exclusion had created a society in which millions of people had no wealth, no property, and no political voice. They were tenants on their own ancestral land, paying rent for the privilege of survival. And survival meant the potato. This wasn't a cultural preference or a failure of imagination. It was cold economic logic. When your entire family must survive on a plot barely larger than a garden, and most of what you grow goes to the landlord as rent, the potato is the only crop that produces enough calories per acre to keep everyone alive. By the 1840s, roughly 3 million Irish people ate almost nothing but potatoes. Not because they wanted to. Because the economic system left them no alternative. So when Phytophthora infestans, the water mold that causes potato blight, swept through Ireland in the autumn of 1845, it didn't just destroy a crop. It destroyed the only lifeline available to millions of people who had been deliberately squeezed onto the economic margins of their own country. The first year of blight destroyed about 1/3 of the potato crop. The second year, 1846, was catastrophic. Nearly 3/4 of the harvest was lost. People began to starve in earnest. Entire villages fell silent. Roads became lined with the dead and dying. The disease that followed starvation, typhus, relapsing fever, dysentery, scurvy, killed as many people as hunger itself. Weakened bodies had no defense. Doctors who tried to help often became victims themselves. But here's where the real scandal begins. The fact that makes this story not a tragedy of nature, but an indictment of empire. Ireland did not stop producing food. During every single year of the famine, ships loaded with wheat, barley, oats, butter, eggs, pork, and livestock sailed out of Irish ports, headed for England. In 1847, the worst year of the famine, the year known as Black 47, Ireland exported thousands of ships' worth of food. Cattle were driven to port towns under armed escort. Grain wagons rolled past villages where people lay dying in ditches. The historian Cecil Woodham Smith documented this in devastating detail. While people starved, food left the country because it belonged to the landlords. And the landlords had debts, mortgages, and London lifestyles to maintain. The tenants who grew that food, who plowed the fields, harvested the grain, milked the cows, could not afford to buy any of it. They had already paid their rent. the system was designed to extract, not to feed. And what did the British government do about it? They had a philosophy, and they stuck to it. The philosophy was called laissez-faire, the belief that markets must be left alone, that government interference in economics was not just unwise, but immoral. Charles Trevelyan, the Treasury official put in charge of Irish famine relief, was the living embodiment of this ideology. He once wrote that the famine was, quote, the judgment of God on an indolent and unself-reliant people. He believed that helping the Irish too much would make them dependent. That suffering was, in some cosmic sense, good for them. Under Trevelyan's direction, the British response was a masterpiece of calculated inadequacy. They set up public works programs, making starving people break rocks and build roads to nowhere in exchange for wages so small they still could not afford food. They opened soup kitchens in early 1847. And at their peak, these kitchens fed 3 million people a day. But then after just 6 months, they were shut down. Too expensive, the Treasury said. The market must be allowed to correct itself. Meanwhile, the rest of the world watched, and some responded with more compassion than the empire itself. The Ottoman Sultan reportedly attempted to send a significant sum of aid, and the Choctaw Nation, a people who had themselves survived the Trail of Tears just 16 years earlier, sent what money they could gather. That an indigenous nation still recovering from its own forced displacement showed more generosity toward Ireland than the government that ruled it remains one of the most damning details of this entire story. Then came the Gregory Clause, perhaps the cruelest policy of all. Under this rule, anyone holding more than a quarter-acre of land was ineligible for any form of government relief. Think about what that means. To receive a bowl of soup, a family had to surrender their land, their only asset, their only connection to the future. Once the land was gone, they had nothing, no home, no income, no hope of recovery. And that was exactly the point. The landlords discovered that the famine was profitable. With tenants dead, emigrating, or forced off their land, landlords could consolidate tiny subsistence plots into large commercial grazing farms. Sheep and cattle were more valuable than people. Evictions skyrocketed. Landlords hired gangs of men known as crowbar brigades to tear down homes while families, often sick, often elderly, watched from the roadside. Between 1849 and 1854, nearly 250,000 families, well over 1 million people, were thrown off their land. Constables and soldiers pulled down the roofs of their cottages to ensure they could never return. The landscape was literally cleared of human habitation. Those who survived the evictions faced an impossible choice: the workhouse or the emigrant ship. The workhouses were designed to be as miserable as possible, a deliberate policy to discourage people from seeking help. Families were separated. Conditions were filthy. Disease spread like wildfire. Tens of thousands died inside the very institutions meant to save them. The emigrant ships were no better, and in many cases they were worse. The so-called coffin ships, overcrowded, under-provisioned, disease-ridden vessels with little ventilation and no sanitation, carried desperate families across the Atlantic. The mortality rates on these ships rivaled those of the transatlantic slave trade. Entire families perished at sea. Those who survived the crossing arrived in Canada and America sick, traumatized, and penniless. At Gros Isle in Quebec, a quarantine station became a mass graveyard. In the summer of 1847 alone, thousands of Irish refugees died there, many buried in unmarked trenches within sight of the shore they had fought so hard to reach. Now, the numbers. Ireland's population in 1841 was approximately 8.2 million. By 1851, it had fallen to 6.5 million. 1 million dead from starvation and disease. Over 2 million emigrated. And the bleeding didn't stop. Emigration continued for decades. Ireland's population would never recover. Even today, in 2026, the Republic of Ireland has barely 5 million people. No other European country experienced demographic devastation on this scale in the modern era. The Irish language, once spoken by millions, retreated to isolated pockets along the western coast. Entire communities, entire ways of life, entire oral traditions vanished with the people who carried them. Some historians have used the word genocide. Others argue that genocide requires proven intent to destroy a people, and that British policy, however callous, fell short of that threshold. But here is what is beyond dispute. The British government had the resources, the infrastructure, and the knowledge to prevent mass death in Ireland, and they chose not to. They chose ideology over humanity. They chose the sanctity of property, rights, over the sanctity of human life. The Irish famine was not a natural disaster. The Blight was natural. Everything that followed was a choice made by landlords who valued rent over lives, a choice made by politicians who valued economic theory over evidence, a choice made by an empire that saw an entire people as expendable, as a cost of doing business. The Blight killed the potatoes, but it was the system, the landlords, the laws, the ideology that killed the people. And that is a truth that no schoolbook summary can ever contain.